Welcome to Sleepy Crime. Before we begin tonight's case, I'd love to know where are you watching from right now. It's always fascinating to see these stories reach people from all over the world. And if you enjoy these quiet, late-night dives into true crime, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Whether you're lying in bed, wrapped in a blanket, or sitting in a dimly lit room with your headphones on, let the outside world fade away. Let your breathing slow, let your shoulders loosen, and let yourself settle into the calm of the night. In May of 1977, 20-year-old Colleen Stan set out on what was supposed to be a simple trip to visit friends. She packed light, smiled at her roommates, and left her home in Eugene, Oregon, expecting nothing more than a weekend getaway. She hitchhiked, something many young people did back then, trusting the kindness of strangers and the openness of the road. But on a quiet highway near Red Bluff, California, a single decision, a single ride accepted, would change everything. The couple who stopped for her looked ordinary, friendly, even. A young man, his wife in the passenger seat, and a baby in the back. There was nothing threatening about them. And so Colleen got in the car, never imagining that this small, seemingly harmless choice would lead her into one of the most harrowing captivity stories in true crime history. This is the story of Colleen Stan, the girl who became known as the girl in the box. Let's begin. Colleen Stan was 20 years old in the spring of 1977, full of the restless energy of youth and the optimism that often comes with it. She had grown up in Eugene, Oregon, a small city known for its quiet streets and wide skies. By then, she was living with roommates and enjoying a sense of independence for the first time in her life. On the morning of May 19th, she decided to hitchhike south to Red Bluff, California, to visit friends for the weekend, something she had done before without incident. Hitchhiking in the late 70s was common, especially among young people who didn't have cars of their own. It was seen as adventurous, even liberating. There was a certain unspoken trust on the open road, strangers helping strangers, travelers swapping stories, and kindness exchanged in passing. Colleen had done it enough times to feel confident. She packed lightly, left early, and waved goodbye to her roommates, expecting nothing more than a short, pleasant trip. By mid-afternoon, she had made good progress. She had already turned down one ride from a group of young men that made her uncomfortable, a small decision that, in hindsight, saved her from an uncertain fate. When the blue Dodge Colt pulled up beside her, it seemed like the safer choice. Inside were a young couple, a man in his early 20s, his wife sitting quietly in the passenger seat, and a baby strapped into a car seat in the back. Colleen relaxed at the sight. Married couples with children didn't seem threatening, and she trusted her instincts enough to believe this was a safe ride. The man introduced himself as Cameron Hooker and his wife as Janice. They exchanged casual small talk as the car headed south along the long stretches of rural highway. The day was warm, the hum of the engine steady, and the baby's occasional fussing filled the silences. Everything about the drive felt ordinary, at least at first. But small, subtle signs began to unsettle Colleen. Cameron was quiet, more focused on the road than conversation. Janice spoke little, and when she did, her voice carried a soft, flat tone. There was no hostility, but there was an absence of warmth, a faint tension between the two of them that Colleen couldn't quite place. Still, she brushed it off. She was almost to Red Bluff, and she didn't want to seem paranoid. At one point, Cameron pulled into a gas station and told Colleen she could use the restroom if she needed. As she opened the car door, she paused. A small voice inside told her to run, to find another ride, to walk away, but she ignored it. She later said she felt a strange pressure, as though leaving would be making too much trouble. When she returned to the car, she smiled politely and climbed back in. Minutes later, the mood in the car shifted. Cameron veered off the main road, turning onto a smaller, more isolated route. He told Colleen he wanted to show her a beautiful scenic spot nearby. Before she could respond, he stopped the car. Everything happened fast. Cameron pulled a knife, the blade flashing briefly in the afternoon light. Janice turned around and handed him a strange wooden object from the back seat, a box carefully constructed, lined with dark material inside. Before Colleen could react, Cameron forced her to put her head inside it. The box fit tightly, enclosing her face and ears, cutting off sound and sight. Darkness swallowed her completely. Colleen later recalled the surreal disorientation of that moment. 1 second, she was breathing fresh air under an open sky, and the next, she was sealed in silence. She couldn't hear the baby anymore, couldn't see the couple, couldn't even tell which direction the car was moving. It was an immediate, absolute erasure of identity. She was no longer Colleen, a young woman traveling to visit friends. She was an object in the back seat of a stranger's car. The ride lasted for what felt like hours. Time fractured inside the box, minutes stretched endlessly, each bump of the road jolting her body and sending waves of panic through her chest. She tried to control her breathing, to fight the dizziness closing in. But the darkness made it impossible to know where she was going, or what was waiting when the car finally stopped. When the vehicle pulled into a driveway, Colleen sensed the shift, the crunch of gravel, the slowing of speed. Hands grabbed her roughly, pulling her out of the car. She stumbled, her head still locked inside the suffocating wooden box. She could smell earth, grass, and something damp in the air. There were footsteps, a door opening, the faint echo of voices she couldn't quite make out. Then came the stairs. Cameron and Janice guided her down into a basement. The air grew cooler, heavier. When the box was finally removed from her head, Colleen blinked against the sudden light. What she saw was unsettling, a small, windowless room, its walls bare, its corners shadowed. There was a strange tension in the air, as though this place had been prepared for her. Cameron didn't waste time. He told her plainly that she now belonged to him, that she would obey or suffer. To drive the point home, he introduced an elaborate lie that would shape the next 7 years of her life. He told her there was a powerful secret organization, the company, that monitored everything she did. If she tried to escape, they would hunt her down. They would kill her, and they would kill her family. Colleen didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a sophisticated system of psychological control, one that Cameron had planned meticulously, using isolation, fear, and manipulation to break her sense of reality. That night, Cameron placed Colleen inside a specially constructed wooden box barely big enough to hold her curled body. The lid shut with a heavy, deliberate finality. It was dark, silent, and stifling inside, the air warm and thin. She could hear faint sounds above her, footsteps, creaking boards, the muffled cries of the baby, but the box became her entire world. In the following days, Colleen's existence narrowed to a simple, brutal rhythm: confinement, silence, and fear. She didn't know where she was, how much time was passing, or what would happen next. She clung to small fragments of hope, telling herself that someone would notice she was missing, that the police would come. But as hours turned into days, and days began to blur together, that hope slowly dissolved. Outside, no one knew where Colleen had gone. Her friends assumed she had changed her plans. Her roommates didn't panic right away. She was independent, adventurous, and it wasn't unusual for her to be spontaneous. By the time anyone started asking questions, Colleen was already deep inside a nightmare that would stretch on for years. Cameron, meanwhile, grew more confident. He had succeeded in bringing Colleen under his control, not just physically, but psychologically. In his mind, he was in complete command of her life. The box wasn't just a tool of restraint, it was a weapon of erasure, designed to strip Colleen of her sense of self, to make her compliant without force. And it was working. This was only the beginning. The first 72 hours after Colleen Stan's abduction were an exercise in total disorientation. The moment Cameron and Janice Hooker forced the wooden box over her head and led her into their home, the reality she knew collapsed into something unrecognizable. Gone were the open skies of Oregon, the soft hum of cars passing on the highway, the sense of control over where she was going and why. In its place was silence, darkness, and confinement so absolute it defied understanding. Cameron led Colleen into a small, bare room in the basement. The walls were cold cement, the air damp and faintly metallic, carrying the smell of tools and wood shavings. When he removed the box from her head, the sudden light made her squint, but she had little time to adjust before he started giving orders. His voice was steady, deliberate, the voice of someone who had planned this moment down to the smallest detail. Colleen was forced to undress, her belongings stripped from her, her identity erased piece by piece. Cameron bound her wrists and ankles, gagged her, and left her lying on the basement floor while he prepared something in the corner. She would later learn it was the wooden head box, a specially designed restraint device he had built himself. It wasn't simply meant to trap her physically. It was meant to silence her completely, enclosing her head in darkness and muffling all sound. When Cameron placed the box over her head again and secured it, Colleen described the feeling as suffocating, as though the air itself had thickened. The space inside was barely large enough to accommodate her nose and mouth, and each breath came shallow and hot. The pressure of the wood around her skull amplified every small sound, her own heartbeat, the rasp of her breath, the muffled footsteps somewhere above her, until the outside world seemed far away, unreachable. Hours passed this way, but inside the box, time dissolved. Cameron and Janice went about their lives upstairs, cooking, caring for the baby, listening to music, while Colleen lay in the basement, trapped inside darkness so complete she sometimes wondered if she had gone blind. Her sense of self began to slip. Panic flared, subsided, flared again. She alternated between waves of terror and stretches of numb resignation, unsure how much time had passed or what would come next. By the second day, Cameron began introducing his system of control, a layered strategy designed to break her psychologically as well as physically. He removed the box briefly to speak with her, looking her directly in the eye as he told her about the company. He claimed it was a secret, powerful organization that monitored people like her. Slaves, as he called them. If she disobeyed, if she ever tried to escape, the company would come after her. They would kill her, he said, and they would kill her family. For Colleen, disoriented and terrified, the lie lodged deep. The way Cameron spoke, calm, matter-of-fact, as though simply stating the weather, gave it weight. He didn't scream or threaten in obvious ways. He constructed an invisible cage around her, one she couldn't see but instinctively feared. And Janice, sitting quietly in the corner, confirmed every word. Her quiet agreement was perhaps the most chilling part. Another woman, a wife, corroborating the story made it all the more believable. In those early days, Colleen still clung to hope that this nightmare would end quickly, that someone would come looking for her, that Cameron would make a mistake, that she would find a way out. But Cameron understood something most people don't. Survival instincts can be redirected when someone is stripped of control and made to believe that resistance equals death. He played the role of both captor and savior, alternating between cold commands and calculated kindness, reinforcing the idea that compliance was her only safety. Meanwhile, upstairs, life in the Hooker household appeared deceptively normal. Neighbors heard nothing unusual. And anyone who saw Cameron and Janice in town described them as a quiet, polite couple devoted to their baby. It was this veneer of normalcy that allowed what happened in the basement to remain invisible. Colleen's living conditions grew harsher as Cameron tested his methods. He confined her to a narrow wooden box he had constructed beneath the couple's waterbed, an enclosed space measuring barely more than a coffin. The box was lined to muffle sound, designed so completely that anyone standing in the bedroom above would never know someone was hidden beneath their feet. Inside, Colleen had just enough space to curl onto her side. The air grew thick quickly, especially in the summer heat, and she learned to breathe shallowly, conserving oxygen. Insects sometimes crawled along the walls of the box, and the darkness became so total that she couldn't distinguish whether her eyes were open or closed. Her entire world shrank to the dimensions of that wooden chamber, her body pressed against the boards, her mind searching desperately for scraps of comfort, the memory of voices, the scent of grass, the image of sunlight on asphalt. But Cameron's control extended beyond physical confinement. He built rituals around her captivity, creating contracts that declared her his property and making her recite rules of obedience aloud. Janice played her part carefully, alternating between complicity and occasional, calculated sympathy. She told Colleen she, too, had once been owned by Cameron, hinting that compliance had kept her alive. Janice's role added layers of complexity to the dynamic. Colleen wanted to trust her. Janice was another woman, another potential victim, perhaps an ally. But Janice's loyalty to Cameron, her willingness to reinforce his narrative, made her unpredictable. There were moments when she seemed to pity Colleen, when she spoke softly and offered reassurance. And there were moments when she helped Cameron tighten his grip, silently handing him restraints or food without meeting Colleen's eyes. In those first weeks, Colleen's attempts to resist faded into survival instincts. Her thoughts narrowed to the smallest calculations: when Cameron would remove the box, when she would be allowed to breathe fresh air, when she might be given food or water. Over time, Cameron reduced these necessities into rewards for obedience, and so the box became more than a physical prison. It was a tool for conditioning. The longer Colleen stayed inside, the more her body adjusted to stillness, her thoughts adjusting to Cameron's rules. Eventually, she began anticipating his expectations without needing instructions. The girl who had stepped onto the highway just days earlier, free and hopeful, was dissolving into something quieter, someone who lived moment to moment, without plans, without control, and increasingly, without the belief that escape was even possible. Meanwhile, her disappearance drew little immediate attention. In the late 1970s, missing adults often weren't prioritized in investigations unless there was direct evidence of foul play. Colleen's roommates assumed she had stayed longer with her friends. Her family worried but hoped she would call. Weeks passed, then months, without answers. For Colleen, that silence was both crushing and clarifying. The world outside continued without her, and Cameron made sure she understood how far away freedom really was. Each time she hesitated, each time fear flickered in her voice, he would remind her of the company, of the invisible watchers who, he claimed, could hear her thoughts and track her movements. By the end of the first month, Colleen had stopped imagining quick rescues. She focused on endurance instead, counting her breaths in the box, tracking Cameron's footsteps overhead, learning his moods by the weight of silence in the house. Somewhere deep down, a part of her held onto the hope of survival. But on the surface, she began to adapt. That, after all, was the goal Cameron had envisioned from the start: to transform Colleen from a free individual into someone who accepted her captivity as inevitable. What neither of them knew, however, was that this new reality, this system of control built on fear, manipulation, and silence, would last not for days, not for months, But for 7 long years, by the end of the first few weeks, Colleen Stan's world had already been stripped down to silence, darkness, and the careful calculations of survival. But the following months marked the beginning of something deeper and more insidious, Cameron Hooker-esque construction of an entire alternate reality. One designed to make her captivity not just a fact of her life, but a belief she would internalize. Cameron understood that physical restraints alone couldn't ensure total obedience forever. Chains could be broken, locks could be picked, but if he could convince Colleen that escape was impossible, he wouldn't need force. He needed her compliance, and to get it, he began weaving a narrative so elaborate and so manipulative that, over time, it became her truth. Central to this narrative was the company, a supposed shadow organization Cameron invented to terrorize her into submission. In his story, the company monitored slaves like her, controlled entire networks of families, and punished anyone who disobeyed or tried to escape. He said they had eyes everywhere, on the highways, in hospitals, even within her own family's home. If she ran, they would find her, and they would make her and her loved ones suffer. It wasn't just the words, it was the way Cameron delivered them. He spoke with calm authority, his voice steady, matter-of-fact, as though describing something as ordinary as the weather. Janice, his wife, played an equally important role. She confirmed the existence of the company, adding details to make the lie airtight. Colleen would later recall that Janice's agreement was what sealed it for her. Another woman, another victim, corroborating the story made it impossible to dismiss as fantasy. Soon, Cameron introduced contracts. Written in strict legal language, these documents declared that Colleen was now his property. He made her read them aloud, sign them, and even memorize certain rules about her role. To reinforce the illusion of legitimacy, Cameron threatened her by describing other slaves who had tried to disobey. He claimed they were tortured, killed, or their families destroyed. In her state of fear, isolation, and sensory deprivation, Colleen believed him. By the 3rd month, Cameron had constructed a routine designed to break down her identity entirely. Most of her time was spent in the box beneath the Hooker's waterbed, a cramped, suffocating chamber with barely enough room to curl into herself. The heat was unbearable during the summer, the air growing so thin that each breath felt stolen. The darkness was total, pressing in from every side, until Colleen sometimes couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. Insects crawled along the walls, and the vibrations of footsteps above her were her only reminders of life beyond the box. When Cameron allowed her out, the rules were clear: no speaking without permission, no eye contact, no hesitation when given an order. He dictated everything: when she ate, when she slept, when she was allowed to breathe fresh air. Small gestures of kindness were calculated to deepen her dependence on him: a sip of water, a few minutes of sunlight, a chance to stretch her legs. These moments made the deprivation sharper, and ensured that Colleen associated safety with obedience. Even Janice's role shifted between accomplice and enforcer. There were days when she would act almost sisterly, sitting nearby and talking softly, as though they were two women trapped together in a strange and terrifying situation. And then there were days when she silently handed Cameron restraints, avoided Colleen's gaze, and reinforced the very rules that kept her trapped. This duality kept Colleen off balance, never fully certain whether Janice was a potential ally or another layer of control. Outside, Cameron maintained the appearance of a quiet, ordinary family man. Neighbors described him as polite, reserved, hardworking. No one suspected the secret buried beneath his bedroom floor. He brought Colleen out occasionally, forcing her to perform chores in the house, but only under Janice's supervision. The illusion of a cooperative slave was vital to his fantasy of total power, but it also served another purpose. It normalized her presence in case anyone ever glimpsed her by accident. Then came a shift, one that would blur the boundaries of captivity even further. After nearly a year of strict isolation, Cameron began testing Colleen's loyalty to his rules. He allowed her more freedom within the house and even, on rare occasions, outside of it. He framed these privileges as rewards, making her believe they were contingent on her absolute obedience to both him and the company. One of the most surreal moments of this manipulation came when Cameron permitted Colleen to visit her family. She hadn't seen them in years, and the thought of returning home, even briefly, filled her with hope and dread in equal measure. But Cameron carefully prepared her for the trip. He told her the company would be watching her the entire time. If she said anything, even hinted at what was happening, her entire family would be killed. When Colleen arrived at her parents' home, she smiled, hugged them tightly, and sat at the dinner table as though nothing was wrong. Her family noticed she was thinner, quieter, and strangely subdued, but when they asked about her life, she gave vague, cheerful answers. Inside, she wanted to scream for help, but the invisible weight of the company's threat silenced her. Later, her family would recall that visit as haunting, a moment when the signs were there, but no one could comprehend the reality behind them. After the visit, Colleen returned voluntarily to the Hooker home. To anyone on the outside, this would seem unthinkable. But by then, Cameron's system of control had rewired her instincts. Her sense of safety was tied not to escape, but to compliance. In her mind, freedom was not an option. Survival depended on following the rules. Years passed this way. Cameron refined his techniques, deepening Colleen's submission through carefully orchestrated cycles of punishment and reward. He introduced new rituals, more contracts, and constant reminders of the company's omnipresent power. And as the seasons changed, Colleen's sense of time began to erode completely. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Her life had been reduced to patterns, the muffled darkness of the box, the brief reprieves of fresh air, the quiet voice in her head reminding her that resistance meant death. By the fourth year, the psychological hold was so complete that Cameron no longer needed to monitor her constantly. Colleen performed tasks without commands, anticipated his expectations, and rarely questioned anything he said. He had achieved the compliance he wanted, not by force alone, but by constructing an entire world where his control felt absolute and inevitable. But beneath that surface of obedience, something quieter was brewing. Small cracks had begun forming, not in Colleen's submission, but in the foundations of Cameron's household. Janice, who had spent years playing her role, was beginning to doubt the man she had once believed she loved. She had followed his rules, endured his demands, and helped him maintain the illusion, but the years were wearing her down. And eventually, those doubts would change everything. By the second year of Colleen Stan's captivity, her existence had narrowed to something almost unimaginable, a world that measured barely more than a coffin's dimensions. While Cameron Hooker had spent the first months breaking her spirit through fear, manipulation, and the constant reminder of the company, what followed was a deeper, slower erosion of her sense of self, the dismantling of her identity through relentless sensory deprivation. Cameron built the box beneath his and Janice's waterbed with meticulous precision. It wasn't just a hiding place, it was a tool of absolute control. Constructed from heavy wood, lined to muffle sound, and sealed tightly, it ensured that Colleen could remain undetected even if someone entered the room. The interior was stifling in the summer heat, the air thin and damp, forcing her to breathe slowly and shallowly. Insects sometimes crawled along her skin, and the oppressive darkness was so complete that she couldn't distinguish open eyes from closed ones. Inside this space, Colleen spent up to 23 hours a day. She curled herself into a tight fetal position, her body pressed against the walls, her knees aching from the constant strain. Time lost all meaning. There was no sun, no clock, No sound beyond the occasional muffled creak of footsteps above her. Days bled into nights, and nights into days, until her awareness of passing seasons dissolved entirely. Food and water became part of Cameron's system of reward and punishment. A meal left on the floor beside the box might be generous one day and meager the next, depending on her compliance. Even the chance to stretch her legs or breathe fresh air depended on Cameron's whims. When she was allowed out, the relief was fleeting. Her freedom consisted of small, tightly controlled tasks: cooking, cleaning, caring for Cameron and Janice's baby, always under watch, never without the constant shadow of threat. But Cameron's cruelty was layered beneath the calmest facade. He rarely screamed, rarely raised his voice. Instead, his control came from quiet, deliberate choices, a word withheld here, a small kindness there. He reminded Colleen constantly that the company was monitoring her thoughts and actions, that she was not only his prisoner but their property, and that one misstep could bring catastrophic consequences for her and her family. And over time, the lie rooted itself so deeply in her mind that it became indistinguishable from reality. Perhaps the most devastating part was the way Colleen began to normalize her captivity. At first, she fought panic in the box, clawing at the walls, sobbing until her throat burned, imagining rescue with a desperation that consumed her. But the human mind adapts even to horrors, and gradually she stopped resisting. Instead, she focused on survival in increments: the next breath, the next sip of water, the next time Cameron might lift the lid and let her see light. This adaptation wasn't submission in the way most people imagine it, it was necessity. Faced with no control and no escape, Colleen learned to fold herself inward, conserving energy, quieting her thoughts, enduring. Cameron noticed this shift, and he exploited it fully. He began allowing her longer moments outside the box, brief glimpses of sunlight, the chance to help with household chores, but always framed these moments as privileges granted by her obedience. Janice's role during these years remained deeply complex. At times, she seemed like a fellow victim, quietly enduring Cameron's dominance in her own way. She would occasionally bring Colleen food or water, offer small comforts, and even talk to her softly during rare moments when Cameron wasn't watching closely. But Janice also enabled the system, reinforcing the rules, repeating Cameron's warnings about the company, and ensuring Colleen's compliance whenever her husband wasn't present. Whether out of fear, loyalty, or resignation, Janice became an extension of Cameron's control. Outside the Hooker household, life appeared almost startlingly normal. Neighbors saw a quiet, polite couple raising a baby in a modest home. No one suspected that beneath their bedroom floor, a young woman was enduring unimaginable confinement. On the rare occasions when Cameron allowed Colleen into the yard or accompanied the family on short outings, her behavior raised no alarms. She smiled faintly when prompted, stayed quiet, and moved mechanically, always under Cameron's watchful eye. Perhaps the most surreal demonstration of Cameron's power came when Colleen visited her family again. After years in captivity, Cameron granted her permission to attend a gathering, but not without meticulous preparation. He reminded her of the company, insisting that agents would be monitoring her every word and movement. If she broke the rules or hinted at the truth, he told her, her entire family would die. Colleen sat at the dinner table that day, surrounded by people who loved her, and said nothing. Her family sensed something was off. She seemed thinner, paler, quieter, but she smiled when they asked about her life, answering in vague phrases Cameron had rehearsed with her. She hugged her parents, kissed her siblings, and then returned voluntarily to the Hooker home. To outsiders, it was baffling. To Colleen, it was survival. Over the years, the combination of confinement, psychological manipulation, and orchestrated kindness reshaped her completely. She stopped thinking of escape as possible let alone safe. Her identity blurred into the routines Cameron dictated. The box, the chores, the brief tastes of sunlight, the quiet nods of obedience. For 7 years, this was her life. But cracks were forming, though not in Colleen's mind, in Janice's. After years of playing her role in Cameron's elaborate system of control, Janice began to question not only the morality of what they were doing but the very foundation of Cameron's authority. She was growing weary of his dominance, skeptical of the company's existence, and increasingly frightened by how far Cameron's fantasies had gone. This growing tension would eventually set the stage for everything that followed: Colleen's escape, Cameron's arrest, and the unraveling of one of the most disturbing captivity cases in modern history. But before freedom came, there would be one more turning point, one more test of endurance inside that box. By the 6th year of Colleen Stan's captivity, Cameron Hooker believed he had achieved the perfect system of control. Through fear, deprivation, and manipulation, he had reduced her world to a box beneath his bed and convinced her that every choice she made, every breath she took, was monitored by an invisible, omnipotent force: the company. To Cameron, Colleen's compliance proved his power was absolute. But beneath the surface, forces he could not see were beginning to shift, and they would ultimately unravel everything he had built. The first crack came not from Colleen, but from Janice. For years, Janice had played the role Cameron demanded: the obedient wife, the quiet accomplice, the woman who reassured Colleen that the company was real and escape was impossible. She had helped him maintain the fantasy, partly out of fear, partly out of a complicated loyalty to the man she once believed she loved. But by the early 1980s, Janice was reaching her breaking point. Living under Cameron's dominance had taken a heavy toll. She had endured years of psychological and physical control herself, and as time went on, her faith in his authority, and in the lies he used to maintain it, began to crumble. The idea of the company, once as real to her as it was to Colleen, started to feel flimsy, inconsistent, impossible to reconcile with the world outside their home. Quiet doubts became persistent thoughts, and persistent thoughts became questions she was no longer able to silence. The strain within the Hooker household was becoming obvious even to Colleen, despite her isolation. She began noticing subtle changes in Janice's behavior, moments when her voice trembled, when her instructions didn't align perfectly with Cameron's narrative, when her eyes lingered on Colleen just a little too long. There were small acts of kindness, too: Janice slipping her an extra sip of water, loosening the restraints slightly when Cameron wasn't watching, sitting with her in silence on the rare occasions when Cameron left them alone. For Colleen, these gestures were confusing. She had come to associate Janice with Cameron's power, with reinforcement of the rules, and the crushing reality of her captivity. But in these moments, she saw glimpses of something else: doubt, exhaustion, and perhaps a kind of reluctant solidarity. Around this time, Cameron's experiments in control grew riskier. By now, Colleen's submission was so complete that he felt confident enough to allow her greater freedoms, carefully framed as privileges she had earned through her obedience. He permitted her to do yard work without constant supervision, trusted her to clean different parts of the house alone, and occasionally let her spend short periods outside the box. One of the most surreal turning points came when Cameron allowed Colleen to visit her family again, this time for an extended stay. He rehearsed the visit carefully, reminding her over and over that the company would be monitoring her every movement. He repeated the same threats he had drilled into her for years: if she disobeyed or said anything out of place, the company would kill her and everyone she loved. When Colleen arrived at her parents' home, the scene was heartbreaking in its normalcy. The smell of familiar cooking, the warm embrace of loved ones, the sounds of laughter, all the things she had been denied for so long surrounded her, and yet she couldn't enjoy them. She smiled, answered questions softly, and gave rehearsed responses whenever anyone asked about her life. Inside, she was fighting waves of longing and panic, torn between wanting to scream for help and fearing that doing so would bring catastrophic consequences. Her parents sensed that something was deeply wrong. They noticed her thin frame, her subdued manner, the way her eyes seemed distant and guarded. But when they pressed gently for answers, Colleen insisted she was fine. To them, she appeared free. There was no gun, no lock, no captor standing behind her, and so they took her at her word. When the visit ended, Colleen returned voluntarily to the Hooker home. It was unthinkable to outsiders, but to Colleen, the decision made sense. In her mind, she wasn't returning to captivity, she was keeping her family safe. The company's shadow stretched so far and so deep in her mind that freedom felt more dangerous than the box beneath the bed. But Janice's doubts were only deepening. Watching Colleen walk back into their home, silent and compliant after seeing her family, shook something inside her. The lie of the company, the justifications she had accepted for years, and the life she and Cameron had built, all of it began to feel unbearable. Over the following months, Janice's small gestures of rebellion grew bolder. She spoke to Colleen in quieter tones, offering comfort without words. She hesitated when Cameron issued commands, questioned his decisions in ways she never had before. These small ruptures didn't escape Cameron's notice. He grew frustrated, snapping at Janice more often, tightening his grip not only on Colleen but on his wife as well. For Colleen, Cameron's growing volatility was terrifying, but it also marked the beginning of something unexpected: change. She began to sense that his control wasn't as absolute as she had once believed. For years, the rules had felt unshakable, immutable, and forced by an omnipotent force she couldn't see. But now small inconsistencies, Janice's hesitations, Cameron's mistakes, the silence of the company during moments when Colleen expected retribution, began to plant tiny seeds of doubt. The turning point came when Janice finally decided she couldn't live under Cameron's domination any longer. Her doubts about the company had solidified into certainty. It didn't exist. The years of manipulation, the contracts, the threats, it was all Cameron. She began to see Colleen not as a slave but as another victim trapped in the same nightmare she had endured. And with that realization came a choice that would change everything. Janice approached Colleen one quiet afternoon while Cameron was at work. She sat across from her, hands trembling, and told her the truth. There was no company. There were no agents watching her family, no invisible network ready to strike if she disobeyed. Everything Cameron had told her for 7 years had been a lie designed to keep her compliant. For Colleen, the revelation was overwhelming. Relief, anger, confusion, and fear collided all at once. Part of her wanted to reject the truth entirely, to cling to the structure that, however painful, had kept her alive. But as Janice spoke, the cracks widened, and reality began to flood in. That moment marked the beginning of Colleen's path back to herself, though freedom would not come instantly. Trusting Janice wasn't easy. Trusting anyone after 7 years of psychological manipulation was almost impossible. But as days passed, Janice's actions began to align with her words. She subtly loosened Cameron's rules, allowed Colleen small choices, and began quietly planning for the day they would both break free. Colleen didn't know it yet, but the walls Cameron had spent years constructing, not the ones of wood and locks, but the ones built inside her mind, were beginning to crumble. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine something she hadn't dared before: escape. By 1984, Colleen Stan had endured 7 years of captivity under Cameron Hooker's control. For nearly a decade, she had lived inside a constructed reality, one where an invisible, all-powerful company dictated every decision, and where her only safety lay in compliance. But Janice Hooker's growing doubts had now become certainty. The company didn't exist. Cameron's elaborate web of manipulation was beginning to unravel, and with it came the first fragile possibility of freedom. Janice's confession to Colleen that everything Cameron had told her was a lie didn't spark immediate escape. After years of psychological conditioning, Colleen struggled to believe it. The idea that she could simply walk away, that the rules she had followed for so long weren't real, felt impossible. But Janice was patient. Over the following days, she reinforced the truth in quiet conversations while Cameron was away. She explained how she, too, had once been trapped under his control, believing the same threats. And she told Colleen something else. She was planning to leave Cameron, and she wanted Colleen to come with her. In the meantime, Cameron remained oblivious to the growing alliance between the two women. He still believed his control was absolute, confident that Colleen's compliance proved the effectiveness of his system. He allowed her to perform errands outside the house, to interact briefly with neighbors, and even to work in the yard unsupervised, never imagining that her mind was beginning to shift. The turning point came when Cameron revealed his intention to take a second slave. For Janice, it was the breaking point. She had endured years of emotional control and physical manipulation, but the thought of another woman suffering what Colleen had endured was unbearable. Janice realized she couldn't remain silent any longer. One night, while Cameron was asleep, Janice told Colleen her plan. They would wait until he left for work the next morning. She would give Colleen bus fare, explain how to contact her family, and warn her to leave immediately without looking back. Colleen listened, her heart pounding, torn between hope and terror. Every instinct Cameron had drilled into her screamed that this was a trap, that the company would somehow intervene, that her escape would trigger punishment not just for her but for her parents. But as dawn broke and Cameron left the house, Colleen made a choice. She gathered the few belongings Janice quietly handed her, some cash, bus fare, and a slip of paper with instructions, and walked out the door. For the first time in 7 years, she crossed the threshold without permission. Each step away from the Hooker home felt surreal. Her senses were heightened, the sound of gravel under her shoes sharp in her ears, the sunlight almost blinding after years of dim confinement. When she reached the bus station, her hands shook as she bought a ticket, expecting at any moment to feel Cameron's hand on her shoulder, to hear someone shout her name, to see faceless agents of the company descending upon her. But none of it happened. The bus arrived, the doors opened, and Colleen boarded quietly. Sitting near the back, her eyes fixed on the window as the Hookers' small town receded into the distance. For the entire ride to her parents' home, her fear didn't subside. Every stop, every new passenger, every sound outside the window seemed like a signal that danger was still close. But when she finally arrived and stepped off the bus into her mother's arms, something inside her shifted. She had made it home. She was safe, at least for the moment. Reuniting with her family was overwhelming. They were stunned, overjoyed, and devastated all at once, struggling to reconcile the quiet, composed young woman standing in front of them with the reality of what she had endured. But Colleen didn't stay long. After only a short visit, she did something almost no one could understand at the time. She returned to the Hookers' home. The decision shocked her family and would later confuse investigators. But in Colleen's mind, it was simple. Janice was still there, and Colleen believed she couldn't leave her behind. She returned not to resume captivity, but to help Janice escape as well. That return would mark the final collapse of Cameron's carefully constructed world. When Colleen arrived, she confronted Janice, urging her to leave while Cameron was still at work. Together, the two women gathered what little they could carry and walked out for the last time. Cameron came home to an empty house, no slave, no wife, no one left to control. In the days that followed, Janice made a decision that would seal Cameron's fate. She went to the police. At first, investigators struggled to comprehend the story Janice told. A young woman held captive for 7 years, hidden in a box beneath a bed, manipulated into believing in a fictional organization. It sounded like something out of a thriller, not reality. But when Colleen corroborated the details and showed them the exact layout of the hooker's home, the evidence became undeniable. When police entered the house, they discovered the box. Heavy, claustrophobic, lined to trap sound, a physical manifestation of the psychological prison Cameron had built. They found restraints, contracts, and other tools he had used to maintain control. Everything Colleen and Janice had described matched perfectly, piece by piece, turning an unbelievable story into an undeniable case. Cameron Hooker was arrested shortly afterward. He seemed calm at first, convinced that Colleen wouldn't testify, certain that the company's shadow would keep her silent even now. But the illusion he had nurtured for so many years had finally shattered. Colleen, standing in front of detectives and lawyers, spoke clearly and firmly about everything she had endured. The revelation shocked the entire country. Newspapers dubbed Colleen the girl in the box, and details of her captivity dominated headlines. People struggled to comprehend how someone could be imprisoned so completely, not just physically, but mentally, while living within sight of neighbors, walking streets, and even visiting her own family without ever escaping. Experts would later explain it as coercive control, a calculated dismantling of autonomy so profound that Colleen no longer believed she had the right or ability to save herself. For Colleen, however, freedom was not an instant transformation. Even after leaving the hooker's home, the rules Cameron had drilled into her still echoed in her thoughts. She struggled to accept that the company had never existed, that no one was coming after her family, that the danger was gone. Years of constant fear don't dissolve overnight. But now, for the first time in 7 years, Colleen could make choices for herself. She could breathe without permission, sleep without the weight of a box above her, and stand in the sun without fearing punishment. Cameron Hooker, meanwhile, faced a legal battle that would expose the full depth of his crimes and bring long-awaited justice. By the time Cameron Hooker was arrested, the story of Colleen Stan, the girl in the box, had already captured the attention of the entire country. The details of her captivity, the sheer length of time she had been held, and the psychological control Cameron had wielded over her made the case unlike anything investigators or prosecutors had seen before. But as sensational as the headlines were, the trial itself would prove to be even more disturbing. For Colleen, testifying against Cameron meant reliving everything she had endured: the box, the threats, the contracts, the constant fear of the company. Even after her escape, the rules Cameron had drilled into her for 7 years echoed in her mind. It took time, therapy, and support from her family to prepare her to face him in court. Yet when the day finally came, Colleen walked into the courtroom composed, determined, and ready to tell her story. The prosecution's case focused on two things: the physical evidence recovered from the Hooker home and Colleen's testimony. Detectives had seized the wooden box Cameron had built, the written slave contracts, and numerous restraints and tools he had used to control her. Each item became a physical representation of the nightmare Colleen had described. The jurors didn't just have to imagine her imprisonment. They could see it, touch it, feel the weight of the box that had confined her for 23 hours a day. Colleen's time on the witness stand lasted several days. She spoke quietly, methodically, answering each question with detail and clarity. She described how Cameron had convinced her of the company's existence, how Janice had supported the lie, and how fear for her family's safety kept her compliant even when opportunities to escape presented themselves. When she recounted the years spent in the box, the courtroom fell silent. Some jurors wept openly, others looked down at their notes, unable to meet her gaze. Janice Hooker's testimony was equally crucial. After leaving Cameron, she had decided to cooperate fully with prosecutors, offering insight into Cameron's methods and confirming Colleen's account. Janice revealed how Cameron manipulated not just Colleen but her as well, controlling every aspect of their lives and forcing her into complicity. She admitted to reinforcing the lie about the company, explaining that she herself had once believed it to be real. The defense tried to discredit Colleen's testimony, painting her continued compliance, including her voluntary return after visiting her family, as evidence that she had not truly been held against her will. But the prosecution countered with expert witnesses who explained coercive control and psychological domination. They detailed how Cameron had systematically dismantled Colleen's autonomy, conditioning her to believe that disobedience would lead to catastrophic consequences. One of the most chilling moments came when the wooden box was brought into the courtroom. The prosecutors asked Colleen to step inside and demonstrate how little space she had lived in for years. The sight of a grown woman folding herself into a coffin-like structure struck the jurors with brutal clarity. The silence afterward was heavy and broken, as everyone in the room absorbed the reality of what she had endured. Throughout the trial, Cameron showed little emotion. He rarely looked at Colleen and seemed detached from the proceedings, as though confident that he would somehow walk free. But as the weeks went on and the weight of the evidence mounted, even he began to show signs of strain, a clenched jaw, restless shifting in his seat, flashes of anger when prosecutors described him as a predator. In their closing arguments, the prosecution painted Cameron as a man who had orchestrated a system of control so complete that it erased Colleen's ability to make choices for herself. They reminded the jury of the 7 lost years, the stolen freedom, and the trauma that would follow her for the rest of her life. The defense, in contrast, leaned heavily on the argument that Colleen could have left at any time, a claim that faltered under the mountain of psychological evidence. Deliberations lasted less than a day. On the afternoon of the verdict, the courtroom was packed with reporters, victims' advocates, and members of Colleen's family. When the jury filed back in, the air felt electric with tension. Guilty, the foreperson said, reading the charges one by one. Kidnapping, sexual assault, use of a deadly weapon. Each count carried a heavy penalty, and each was met with the same verdict. Cameron Hooker was sentenced to 104 years in prison, effectively ensuring he would never walk free again. Colleen wept quietly when the verdict was read, not with relief but with exhaustion. For the first time in 7 years, she was no longer looking over her shoulder, no longer waiting for invisible agents of the company to appear. The chains Cameron had built, both physical and psychological, were broken. Janice, too, left the courthouse a free woman, though her cooperation with the prosecution came with its own weight. While she avoided prison time, she carried the burden of knowing how deeply she had participated in Colleen's suffering, however unwillingly. For Colleen, healing was a long process. Freedom didn't come with instant happiness. It came with rebuilding trust in herself and in the world around her. Nightmares haunted her. Crowded spaces triggered anxiety. Even the sound of footsteps above her head would send her spiraling back into memories of the box. But with therapy, support from her family, and her own quiet resilience, she slowly began reclaiming her life. The case of the girl in the box became a landmark in the understanding of coercive control, inspiring changes in how law enforcement and courts approach cases of long-term captivity and psychological manipulation. Experts began to study Colleen's experience, using it to educate investigators, lawyers, and therapists on the profound impact of trauma and the invisible cages built by abusers. Today, Colleen's story serves as a reminder of both human endurance and the chilling depths of manipulation. She survived 7 years of isolation, fear, and domination, and when given the chance, she chose not just to escape but to stand, testify, and ensure her captor could never harm anyone again. When the courtroom finally emptied, and the cameras stopped flashing, Colleen Stan stepped out into a world she had once believed she would never see again. The trial was over. Cameron Hooker was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison, and the shadow of the company, the phantom that had haunted her every thought for 7 long years, had dissolved into nothing. But for Colleen, freedom didn't come with a single moment of triumph. It came slowly, painfully, and unevenly. The first months after the trial were the hardest. Colleen struggled to adapt to a life where choices were hers again, where doors weren't locked, where every sound overhead wasn't a sign of danger. Even small freedoms felt overwhelming. The simple act of walking outside, of feeling the sun on her face, of hearing her own voice without waiting for permission, these things, which most people took for granted, felt strange and fragile. Nightmares plagued her. In the quiet of her room, she would sometimes wake in a panic, convinced she was still inside the box, her breath catching in the imaginary darkness. It took time, therapy, patience, and the gentle support of her family to begin rebuilding trust in the world around her and in herself. Colleen's survival became an extraordinary story of endurance, but it was also a testament to the power of psychological manipulation. Her case reshaped how experts understood coercive control and how law enforcement approached missing persons cases. Janice Hooker faded from public view after the trial, choosing a quieter life away from the chaos Cameron had created. Her testimony had been pivotal in securing his conviction, but her own role in Colleen's captivity weighed heavily on her. For years, she lived with the knowledge that she had both suffered under Cameron's domination and, at times, enabled it. Cameron Hooker, meanwhile, would spend his remaining years behind bars. Even in prison, he showed little remorse, continuing to frame himself as misunderstood rather than monstrous. But for the people of Red Bluff, and the investigators who had uncovered the nightmare inside his home, his name became synonymous with one of the most haunting captivity cases in modern history. Colleen eventually began speaking publicly about her experience. Her calm, steady voice carried the weight of survival without sensationalism. She wanted her story to serve as both a warning and a source of hope, a reminder of the hidden power dynamics that can exist in plain sight, and of the human capacity to endure the unimaginable. Over time, she became an advocate for other victims, sharing her story with law enforcement, therapists, and educators to help them recognize the signs of coercive control before it is too late. The case left a deep mark on the nation's understanding of captivity and trauma. It forced investigators to rethink assumptions about why victims don't just leave, and it helped introduce new frameworks for understanding psychological domination. Colleen, as 7 years in the box, became a symbol of resilience, but also of the dangers that arise when fear, manipulation, and secrecy converge. As years passed, Colleen found peace, though she never forgot. Her story lives on in books, documentaries, and the quiet conversations of survivors who recognize their own experiences reflected in hers. And while the details of her captivity shocked the world, it is her strength, her survival, and her willingness to share what happened that continue to resonate most. But as one story closes, another begins. Because, as haunting as Colleen's ordeal was, the 1980s held another darkness, one unfolding hundreds of miles away, in the heart of Kansas City. There, a quiet, unassuming man named Robert Berdella lived a life that seemed ordinary on the surface. He ran a small shop, collected antiques, and waved politely to neighbors. People who met him described him as eccentric, yes, but harmless. Few suspected that behind the walls of his modest home, He was hiding something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Unlike Colleen's story, this one wouldn't center on psychological chains alone. It would be about physical horrors, meticulously documented in handwritten diaries and photographs. It would involve secrets buried beneath Kansas City's calm exterior and a man whose cruelty would shock even seasoned investigators. This is the story of Robert Berdella, the Kansas City butcher. Robert Berdella didn't look like a predator. In Kansas City during the late 1970s and 1980s, he was known as an eccentric but harmless man, the quiet owner of an antique shop called Bob's Bazaar, a fixture in the local flea market scene. He collected oddities, vintage jewelry, unusual trinkets, rare books, and strange art pieces. He seemed like someone who embraced the offbeat, someone who simply stood outside the norm. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, something much darker was growing. Born on January 31, 1949, in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, Robert Andrew Berdella, Jr. had a childhood that foreshadowed the storm to come. His father, a strict Catholic, imposed rigid discipline on his sons, while his mother maintained silence and distance. As a child, Robert was quiet, introverted, and intelligent, but deeply isolated. He wore thick glasses that magnified his large eyes and made him a target for bullying at school. Other children mocked his appearance, his awkwardness, and his inability to fit in. Books became his escape. While other kids played outside, Robert buried himself in literature, fascinated by stories of power, dominance, and control. By adolescence, he had developed a detached, methodical personality. He wasn't violent as a child, but he showed an unusual fascination with anatomy, once reportedly dissecting small animals and keeping notes, not out of curiosity alone, but out of a desire to understand how bodies worked. By his late teens, Berdella realized he was different in another way. He was gay at a time when being openly gay carried significant stigma. Isolated from peers and disconnected from his strict Catholic upbringing, Robert's sense of alienation deepened. When his father died suddenly of a heart attack when Robert was just 16, the fragile structure of his life fractured further. His relationship with authority, already strained, dissolved into resentment and mistrust. After graduating from high school, Berdella enrolled at the Kansas City Art Institute in 1967, hoping to reinvent himself. But instead of thriving, his darker tendencies began to surface. Teachers described him as intelligent but increasingly troubled. He became fascinated by avant-garde art, particularly pieces that used shock and discomfort to provoke reactions. Around this time, he began experimenting with drugs, both personally and as a way to gain influence over others. It was during his time at the Art Institute that a disturbing incident occurred. Berdella tortured and killed a duck during a class project, claiming it was performance art. Faculty and students were horrified, but instead of facing serious consequences, he quietly dropped out of school in 1969 and disappeared from the institution's radar. By the early 1970s, Berdella had settled in Kansas City, where he opened his shop and became a familiar face in the Westport flea market. Outwardly, he presented himself as quirky but respectable. He built relationships with other vendors, frequented local art events, and quietly cultivated an image of a man who embraced the strange, but harmlessly so. But behind closed doors, he was developing a double life. In his modest two-story home at 4315 Charlotte Street, Berdella began experimenting with control over people. He formed relationships with young men, many of them vulnerable, often struggling with poverty, addiction, or homelessness. He lured them in with promises of work, money, or simply a safe place to stay. To most, he seemed generous, even friendly. But for Robert, these connections were something else entirely. opportunities to test boundaries, push limits, and eventually inflict pain. Neighbors occasionally noticed odd things, visitors arriving at all hours, muffled noises late at night, strange smells wafting from his home. But Berdella's polite demeanor and standing in the community discouraged suspicion. In Kansas City at the time, people minded their own business, and Robert relied on that silence. By 1984, his experiments had escalated. He began keeping detailed diaries, meticulous records of encounters, documenting every detail of his interactions with his guests. These notes were chillingly clinical, describing methods of restraint, drug dosages, and techniques for breaking his victim's will. What started as fascination had transformed into obsession. And yet, even as his behavior grew darker, Berdella maintained his carefully crafted mask. He hosted small dinner parties, offered advice to fellow collectors, and presented himself as an eccentric but harmless local character. No one could have imagined that the quiet man behind the antique counter was beginning to transform into one of the most notorious killers in Kansas City's history. By the mid-1980s, the line between Robert's public persona and private depravity had vanished entirely. He had built a life where secrets could thrive, a shop to establish respectability, a home designed for privacy, and a set of psychological tools to exploit the vulnerable. But as his confidence grew, so did his recklessness. The stage was set for what would become one of the most horrifying cases investigators had ever seen, the story of a man who kept meticulous records, photographs, and trophies of his victims, believing he had built the perfect system of control. By the late 1970s, Robert Berdella had become a fixture in Kansas City's countercultural community. To most who knew him, he was an eccentric but intelligent man, someone who loved oddities and strange collectibles, someone who seemed harmless, even endearing in his peculiarities. His shop, Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, drew people from all over the city, who were fascinated by his unusual antiques and the strange objects he proudly displayed. Customers described him as polite, sometimes talkative, and always eager to share the stories behind the items he sold. On the surface, he was simply a man making an honest living, running a quirky business, and blending into the rhythms of local life. But beneath that veneer of normalcy, a much darker reality was unfolding. Berdella's house at 4315 Charlotte Street was becoming something entirely different from his storefront, a place where he could test his limits, where he indulged his growing obsession with power and control. His carefully curated shop provided him a shield of credibility and even respectability, while his private life grew stranger, more secretive, and far more dangerous. Throughout the late 1970s, Berdella began forming connections with young men on the margins of society, many of them struggling with poverty, addiction, or unstable family situations. He targeted those who were vulnerable, men who might accept help without asking too many questions. Berdella offered them meals, a couch to sleep on, or work around the shop. He built trust carefully, presenting himself as someone willing to help when no one else would. But his generosity came with unspoken expectations, and over time, he developed a subtle system of influence. As the years passed, his methods became more deliberate. Berdella began experimenting with control, introducing drugs into his interactions, sometimes under the guise of helping his guests relax, other times as a way to cloud their judgment. He became skilled at identifying who would be compliant and who would resist, adjusting his approach to suit each situation. There were moments when he seemed almost compulsively meticulous, taking notes on his interactions, documenting small details, and refining his techniques. Neighbors, for the most part, remained unaware. To them, Berdella was quirky, yes, but also responsible and engaged in the local scene. He attended community events, hosted small gatherings, and built a reputation as someone who was simply different rather than dangerous. The late-night comings and goings, the unusual odors, the occasional screams muffled by heavy walls, these were things no one wanted to question too deeply. By 1982, Berdella's private obsessions had deepened into something far more sinister. He started keeping diaries, small, handwritten records filled with coded entries that detailed his experiments in restraint and manipulation. These weren't just random notes. They were carefully structured accounts, clinical in tone and disturbingly precise. They documented everything: dosages of sedatives, responses to different methods of control, patterns of behavior. To Berdella, these weren't crimes, they were studies, a twisted form of research into dominance and submission. Friends and acquaintances began noticing small shifts in his demeanor. He grew more withdrawn at times, less inclined to engage in casual conversation, his thoughts seeming elsewhere. Yet when anyone asked, he always had explanations ready: business stress, health concerns, or simply fatigue. His ability to maintain a convincing facade allowed him to move freely between his two worlds without raising suspicion. Behind closed doors, however, his actions were escalating. What had begun as small manipulations and subtle exercises of control evolved into something planned, calculated, and deeply disturbing. Berdella was refining his techniques, testing how far he could push without provoking resistance. Each interaction built on the last, teaching him more about his victims' thresholds, their fears, and the fragile line between submission and rebellion. By the mid-1980s, his house had transformed into a private theater of control. The basement and second-floor bedrooms were slowly repurposed, spaces cleared, supplies organized, tools arranged methodically. To anyone who entered casually, the rooms might have seemed unremarkable, perhaps a little cluttered with odds and ends collected over the years. But to Berdella, every object served a purpose, every corner had meaning. His selection of victims became increasingly targeted. He sought out young men he believed wouldn't be missed quickly, individuals estranged from families, struggling with homelessness, or moving through circles where disappearances often went unreported. He manipulated their trust first, offering food, shelter, or work, luring them into a sense of security before revealing the reality of his intentions. Despite the danger building inside his home, Berdella still maintained his presence in the community. At the flea market, he was lively and animated, discussing rare collectibles and antique finds with customers and fellow vendors. His reputation as the guy with the strange shop gave him an air of mystery that intrigued rather than alarmed people. Even those closest to him had no idea that his private life had begun crossing into territories most would struggle to comprehend. By the early months of 1984, his confidence had solidified into something bolder. He had learned to exploit the boundaries between his public identity and private compulsions, weaving them together into a mask that allowed him to walk among people undetected. Yet the patterns were forming, and the signs, had anyone looked closely, were already there: missing young men, sudden disappearances, and unanswered questions. Inside the quiet walls of his home, Berdella believed he was perfecting his system. In reality, he was laying the groundwork for his eventual downfall. By the mid-1980s, the carefully constructed facade of Robert Berdella's ordinary life concealed a reality that was descending into darkness. What began as subtle manipulation and quiet exercises of control was evolving into something far more sinister. Berdella's antique shop, Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, had become a perfect mask, allowing him to cultivate trust and familiarity within the Kansas City community while hiding his growing obsession with dominance behind closed doors. But beneath the eccentric charm and polite conversations, Robert had been preparing for something he had fantasized about for years. It was in July 1984 when his fantasies turned into action. His first known victim was Jerry Howell, a 19-year-old who had known Berdella casually through mutual acquaintances. Jerry was young, restless, and trusting, the kind of person Robert knew how to approach. Berdella offered him a ride to a local dance event, presenting himself as generous, helpful, and safe. Jerry agreed, not realizing the trap he had just stepped into. Instead of driving to the venue, Berdella took Jerry back to his home at 4315 Charlotte Street. Once inside, Robert's demeanor shifted. The friendly, talkative shop owner disappeared, replaced by someone colder, methodical, and unsettlingly calm. Berdella drugged Jerry's drink with powerful sedatives and waited for him to lose consciousness. From that moment forward, the reality Jerry had known ceased to exist. Over the next several days, Berdella kept Jerry restrained in one of the upstairs bedrooms. What set him apart from other predators was his obsession with control, not chaos. He meticulously documented everything in his handwritten journals: the drugs he used, the reactions they caused, the restraints applied, and the techniques he experimented with. The entries were written in a detached, clinical style, as though he were conducting a study rather than committing acts of brutality. The situation escalated rapidly. Berdella wasn't impulsive, he was calculated. He alternated between periods of extreme cruelty and measured kindness, testing how far he could push before breaking his victim's spirit entirely. He deprived Jerry of food and water, manipulated his perceptions of time, and created an atmosphere of complete helplessness. In those long hours inside the locked room, Jerry's will to resist eroded until he became quiet, compliant, and exhausted. On July 5, 1984, just days after being abducted, Jerry Howell died. Berdella later claimed that the overdose of sedatives was unintentional, but his meticulous notes told a different story. He made no attempt to call for help, no effort to save the young man's life. Instead, his journal records continued, documenting Jerry's final moments with the same clinical detachment he had maintained throughout the ordeal. After Jerry's death, Berdella dismembered his body carefully, methodically, and disposed of the remains in trash bags, which were picked up by the local garbage collection service. In Kansas City, no alarms were raised. Jerry was considered a troubled young man, and his disappearance was attributed to his lifestyle rather than foul play. This response emboldened Berdella. In his mind, he had discovered the perfect system: vulnerable victims, minimal suspicion, and a city that didn't ask too many questions. For nearly a year after Jerry's death, Berdella kept his activities restrained, refining his methods, and studying his previous mistakes. But by April 1985, the compulsion returned, and he set his sights on Robert Bobby Sheldon, a 20-year-old drifter who had done small handyman jobs for Berdella in the past. Bobby trusted Robert enough to accept his offer of a place to stay. Once again, the pattern unfolded: sedatives slipped into a drink, restraints carefully applied, and detailed notes recorded in his journals. But Bobby's captivity was different from Jerry's. Berdella experimented with longer periods of wakefulness, alternating doses of drugs to maintain control while ensuring his victim was conscious enough to feel every aspect of his confinement. For 3 days, Bobby endured escalating torture. Berdella documented the effects of various chemicals, testing reactions as though his victim were an unwilling participant in a medical experiment. Eventually, on April 15, 1985, Bobby was killed. Berdella disposed of his body in the same manner as before, packaging the remains into trash bags and placing them out with the weekly garbage collection. Once again, no one noticed. Berdella's confidence was growing. He had now abducted and murdered 2 young men without consequence. But more than that, he had refined his methods. His journals became more detailed, his processes more efficient. He even began keeping a collection of photographs, carefully staged and labeled, capturing his victims during captivity. These images were not chaotic or rushed. They were deliberate, almost methodical, reflecting Berdella's disturbing fixation on control over life and death. By June 1985, his next victim was Mark Wallace, a 20-year-old acquaintance who had spent time around Berdella's shop and occasionally stayed at his home. Mark's situation mirrored those before him, struggling financially, seeking stability, and drawn in by Berdella's offers of food, shelter, and work. He believed he was stepping into a safe space. Instead, he walked directly into a carefully constructed trap. Unlike his previous victims, Mark resisted longer. He fought against the restraints and begged Berdella to release him. But the more Mark resisted, the more extreme Berdella's measures became. He increased the dosage of sedatives, kept him bound in increasingly uncomfortable positions, and adjusted his techniques to prevent escape. By June 23, 1985, Mark Wallace was dead. Once again, his remains disappeared quietly into Kansas City's waste system, vanishing without a trace while the man responsible returned to his shop the next day, chatting casually with customers as if nothing had happened. The pattern was terrifying in its precision. Each abduction followed a familiar rhythm: the false sense of safety, the sedation, the relentless control, and finally, the quiet disposal of bodies. Berdella's growing archive of notes and photographs documented every moment, turning his crimes into a meticulous record of cruelty that investigators would later describe as one of the most disturbing collections they had ever seen. Throughout all of this, Berdella maintained his role as a respected member of Kansas City's alternative scene. At Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, he laughed with customers, offered advice on antiques, and built relationships with vendors who considered him trustworthy. The duality of his life, outwardly harmless, inwardly monstrous, allowed him to operate undetected for years. But each act pushed him further into obsession. His notes became longer, his experiments more elaborate, his confidence unshakable. He believed he had built a perfect system, one where his victims disappeared into silence, and his own life remained untouched. What Robert Berdella didn't realize was that the very habits that gave him a sense of control, the diaries, the photographs, the growing number of risks, were creating a trail investigators would one day follow directly to his door. By 1986, Robert Berdella had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The patterns he had established, luring vulnerable young men into his home, sedating them, restraining them, and meticulously documenting every detail, had evolved into something darker, bolder, and far more calculated. With each victim, his confidence grew, and his methods became increasingly deliberate. The journals he kept expanded into hundreds of pages filled with coded entries, written in a detached, almost scientific tone. For Berdella, this wasn't chaos, it was a project, one he controlled completely. The young men who entered his house during this period rarely came back out alive. Berdella's process had become terrifyingly efficient. He began preparing in advance, stockpiling sedatives, testing different combinations of drugs, refining his restraints, and reorganizing his home to serve his purposes. What had once been a modest Kansas City residence now functioned as a meticulously organized environment built to conceal his crimes. In June 1986, Berdella encountered Todd Stoops, a 21-year-old drifter who had struggled for years with addiction and poverty. Berdella had met Todd before. They'd spoken on several occasions near the flea market, and Berdella had once offered him food and small amounts of money. On this occasion, he invited Todd back to his home, presenting himself once again as a kind, helpful figure. But the moment Todd stepped through the door, Berdella's intentions shifted. Todd's captivity lasted several days and marked one of the most disturbing periods Berdella recorded in his journals. He experimented with new combinations of sedatives to prolong consciousness while deepening submission. He adjusted his methods to keep his victim compliant but aware, a balance that allowed him to maintain maximum control. Each act, each reaction, each failed attempt was documented in exacting detail. To Berdella, this wasn't simply about domination. It was about perfecting a system of control. When Todd died, Berdella disposed of the body using the same method he had refined over previous years. The remains were placed into garbage bags and quietly collected by the city's trash service, vanishing into Kansas City's waste system without a trace. Once again, no one noticed. By now, Berdella's private archive was growing rapidly. He kept photographs of his victims, staging them with deliberate care, capturing their submission in moments designed to solidify his dominance. He labeled and categorized everything: the images, the journals, the tools, constructing a chilling catalog of his crimes. To him, these were trophies of control, proof of his mastery over life and death. But his growing collection created a dangerous vulnerability. Each photograph, each note, each carefully packaged record of his actions was evidence waiting to be discovered. Berdella believed he was untouchable, convinced that his victims' marginalized lives and his careful planning made him invisible. Yet with every act, the risks he took multiplied, and the trail he left behind grew clearer. By September 1986, Berdella abducted another young man, Larry Pearson, whom he had met through acquaintances in Kansas City's underground scene. Larry had trusted Robert enough to spend time at his house, where Berdella once again used sedatives to overpower him. But this time, the captivity stretched longer, lasting nearly 6 weeks. Larry's imprisonment marked a turning point. Berdella began experimenting with more extreme forms of control, testing physical endurance alongside psychological submission. He manipulated Larry's sense of time, alternating between enforced silence and carefully staged conversations designed to break his resistance. In his journals, Berdella recorded new techniques, meticulously noting what worked and what didn't. But Larry was different from Berdella's previous victims. He resisted until the end, never fully submitting, and this defiance frustrated Berdella deeply. After weeks of confinement, Larry died under circumstances Berdella would later describe coldly, as though recounting an inevitable conclusion rather than a deliberate act. Throughout this period, Berdella's outward persona remained unchanged. He smiled behind the counter of Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, trading jokes with vendors, discussing rare antiques, and maintaining his reputation as a harmless eccentric. Few could have imagined that, just blocks away, his home had become a chamber of horrors. The duality of his life fascinated him. In public, he was Robert the shop owner, the man who hosted small dinners, exchanged stories, and offered advice on collectibles. Behind closed doors, he was something entirely different, a man consumed by compulsion, recording every secret in notebooks stacked neatly on his shelves. The sharp contrast between these two identities became a source of confidence. If no one had suspected him yet, why would they start now? By 1987, Berdella had become fully immersed in his dark routines. He refined his processes further, adding layers of planning and preparation to each encounter. He researched chemical reactions, tested substances on himself to measure potency, and meticulously cataloged the results. The cold, methodical tone of his notes revealed a disturbing detachment from reality. His victims were no longer people to him. They were subjects in an experiment designed to satisfy his growing obsession with control. Friends and acquaintances who visited his home noticed unsettling changes without fully understanding them. The blinds stayed drawn more often. Rooms were locked without explanation. The smell of chemicals lingered faintly in the air. Yet no one confronted him directly, partly because Berdella remained polite and friendly, and partly because few wanted to believe that something so horrifying could be happening in their midst. The Kansas City Police Department received missing persons reports, but at the time, no one connected the disappearances to Berdella. Many of his victims lived on society's edges, estranged from families, grappling with addiction, or moving within transient communities where sudden vanishing acts were tragically common. The lack of immediate follow-up created a vacuum that allowed Berdella to operate undetected. By this point, Robert Berdella had convinced himself that he had perfected the art of invisibility. He believed his victims were chosen too carefully, his methods too refined, and his public persona too well-crafted for anyone to suspect him. But he didn't realize that the meticulous records he created, the journals, the photographs, the careful documentation of each act, would eventually become the very thing that exposed him. He also didn't realize that his next victim would not vanish quietly into Kansas City's shadows. Instead, one man's survival would ignite a chain reaction that unraveled every carefully guarded secret inside 4315 Charlotte Street. By the spring of 1988, Robert Berdella's world was spinning deeper into darkness. He had perfected his methods, refined his rituals, and grown confident in his ability to lure young men into his home and erase them from the outside world. But the system he believed to be flawless was about to fracture. The unraveling began when he crossed paths with Christopher Bryson, a 22-year-old who would become the key to exposing everything Robert had spent years hiding behind closed doors. Christopher had been struggling. Like many of Berdella's victims, he was navigating the edges of society, disconnected from his family, and moving through circles where instability was common. Berdella spotted him one evening in Kansas City's Westport district and struck up a casual conversation. He offered Christopher a place to rest, something to eat, and the promise of safety for the night. Trust, once again, became the opening move in Robert's carefully constructed trap. Once inside the house at 4315 Charlotte Street, the pattern began. Berdella drugged Christopher's drink with sedatives, waited for him to lose consciousness, and restrained him in the upstairs bedroom. But by this point, Robert's obsession had evolved into something far more elaborate and dangerous than with his earlier victims. Christopher woke up to find himself tied tightly to the bed, his hands and feet secured, the room dimly lit. Robert entered carrying a notepad and a camera, his demeanor calm and methodical. Over the following hours, Berdella began documenting everything, just as he had with his previous victims. Each act, each response, each attempt at resistance, recorded in his coded journals and preserved in photographs he carefully staged. But Christopher was different. Unlike some of the others, he watched closely, observing Berdella's movements, his habits, his routines. He noted when Robert left the room, when he returned, and how long he disappeared into the basement. He listened to the creak of footsteps and memorized the sequence of locks he heard from behind the door. He wasn't just enduring, he was preparing. Berdella, confident after years of operating undetected, grew careless. He had grown so accustomed to total control that he underestimated Christopher's resolve. Over the course of several days, Christopher endured Robert's increasingly cruel methods, prolonged restraints, alternating sedation with forced wakefulness, and constant threats designed to break his will. But instead of collapsing into compliance, Christopher's focus sharpened. He knew his only chance was to wait, to endure, and to escape when the moment came. That moment arrived on the morning of April 2, 1988. Berdella had left Christopher loosely bound while stepping out to take a phone call downstairs, believing his captive too weak to resist. But Christopher, drawing on every ounce of strength, worked his wrists free from the knots. Barefoot and terrified, he grabbed a thin towel from the bed, wrapped it around his bruised body, and moved quietly to the window. The second-story drop loomed below him, but staying meant death. Without hesitation, he climbed out and leapt, landing hard on the pavement but somehow avoiding serious injury. Stumbling, shaking, and still partially bound, Christopher ran barefoot down the street, his breath ragged, his legs carrying him farther than he thought possible. He made it to a neighbor's house, where he pounded desperately on the door. When the resident opened it and saw his condition, the rope burns, the bruises, the terror in his eyes, they immediately called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived. Christopher, trembling but coherent, told them exactly where he had escaped from and what was inside the house on Charlotte Street. His words were fragmented but urgent, a description of the restraints, the drugs, the photographs, and the things Robert had done. When police reached Berdella's home, Robert opened the door calmly, as though nothing unusual had happened. He denied everything at first, offering explanations and insisting there had been a misunderstanding. But the officers, acting on Christopher's testimony, requested entry, and once inside, they saw enough to change the course of the investigation forever. In the upstairs bedroom, they found ropes, chains, bottles of sedatives, syringes, and Polaroid photographs showing images too disturbing to comprehend at first glance. The walls were lined with items meticulously arranged, tools laid out in precise order, and a collection of notebooks stacked neatly on a shelf. Inside those notebooks, investigators would later discover over 7 years of coded entries, a chilling record of what had happened to at least 6 young men who were now missing. Each entry described methods of control, drug dosages, and the reactions of his victims, written in the cold, detached language of someone documenting an experiment rather than human suffering. The Polaroids, hundreds of them, confirmed the nightmare. They captured his victims bound, restrained, and in various stages of life and death. Among the images were faces that investigators recognized from missing persons reports filed years earlier. Outside the house, the neighborhood buzzed with shock. People who had known Berdella for years, neighbors, vendors at the flea market, customers from his shop, struggled to reconcile the quiet man they thought they knew with the horrors unfolding inside his home. He had been eccentric, yes, but polite and seemingly harmless. No one had imagined the nightmare that had been hidden in plain sight. Robert Berdella was arrested on the spot. Even as police escorted him from the house, he appeared calm, almost detached, as though he still believed he could control the situation. But the evidence inside his home left little room for denial. Christopher Bryson's escape shattered the illusion of invincibility Berdella had cultivated for so long. For years, his confidence had been built on silence, victims who vanished without a trace, families who received no answers, a community that never suspected him. But one man's courage exposed everything. News of the arrest spread rapidly through Kansas City. The headlines grew more sensational by the hour. Torture chamber discovered, Polaroid house of horrors, shop owner arrested in serial killings, reporters camped outside Charlotte Street, filming as investigators carried out boxes of evidence, photographs, restraints, journals, and personal belongings of the missing. For the police, the investigation was only beginning. What they had uncovered in those first hours was horrifying enough, but the deeper they dug into Berdella's life, the more disturbing the picture became. Each notebook entry, each Polaroid, each seemingly ordinary object inside the house connected to stories of suffering that had remained hidden for years. And yet, as overwhelming as the evidence was, the scope of Berdella's crime still wasn't fully understood. It would take months to catalog the materials and reconstruct the timeline of his victims. For families who had spent years wondering about their missing sons and brothers, the revelations would bring both devastating answers and unrelenting grief. Robert Berdella had built a world designed to remain secret forever. But Christopher Bryson's escape had pulled open a door that could never be closed again. The quiet house on Charlotte Street was no longer just another unremarkable Kansas City home. It had become a crime scene, one that would haunt the city and investigators for decades to come. When police stepped into 4315 Charlotte Street on April 2, 1988, following Christopher Bryson's escape, they had no idea they were walking into one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Kansas City's history. The house appeared ordinary from the outside, a small two-story home with faded paint and a modest yard. But inside, investigators would uncover a meticulously constructed chamber of horrors, a hidden world that Robert Berdella had spent years creating, refining, and concealing. The upstairs bedroom was the first place officers searched. What they found stunned even seasoned investigators. The bed where Christopher had been restrained was neatly made, but beneath it were coils of rope, duct tape, leather straps, and wooden dowels designed to keep victims immobilized for long periods. On a nearby table, there were syringes, bottles of sedatives, and handwritten labels indicating precise dosages. The room was cold, quiet, and eerily organized, as though every object had been placed deliberately with purpose. Then came the discovery of the Polaroids, hundreds of them. The images documented Berdella's victims from the moment they entered his home until their final hours. Some showed them unconscious, others restrained and awake, and some depicted moments investigators would later describe as unimaginably cruel. Each photograph was labeled and catalogued in a way that mirrored Berdella's meticulous personality. Next, investigators uncovered the journals, dozens of spiral notebooks filled with coded entries. At first, the symbols and abbreviations seemed random, but forensic analysts quickly began deciphering them. Each line corresponded to a specific victim, recording the drugs used, the methods of restraint, and the exact timing of every act Berdella performed. The notes weren't emotional. They were clinical, detached, as if written by someone conducting experiments rather than committing unspeakable crimes. In addition to the photographs and journals, police discovered a collection of tools, chemicals, and personal items belonging to missing young men. There were wallets, identification cards, clothing, and personal trinkets neatly stored in boxes, each labeled with dates. These objects served as trophies, reminders of the control Berdella exerted over his victims, and the secrecy he believed he would maintain forever. Downstairs, investigators noticed the faint but persistent odor of chemicals. Following the trail led them to the basement, where they found evidence of where Berdella had disposed of his victims' remains. While Kansas City sanitation records later confirmed that many of the bodies had been collected with household trash, small fragments remained in pipes, drains, and hidden corners. The realization sent a chill through the investigative team. For years, the remains of young men had left this house and been carried away without anyone knowing. The evidence painted a devastating picture. Between 1984 and 1987, at least 6 confirmed victims had been abducted, tortured, and killed by Berdella. Many were young men on the margins of society, individuals struggling with poverty, homelessness, or addiction. Some had been reported missing, while others had slipped through the cracks entirely, their disappearances largely unnoticed. The methodical nature of the crimes left investigators both horrified and fascinated. This wasn't chaos or impulse, this was control, calculated down to the smallest detail. Berdella had constructed an entire system, one he believed was foolproof. The journals proved it. Every movement, every chemical dosage, every photograph had a purpose. He had treated human lives like data points in an ongoing study, reducing his victims to numbers, abbreviations, and coded entries. As officers catalogued the evidence, the scale of the case became clear. The photographs and journals were sent to specialists for analysis, while missing persons cases spanning nearly a decade were reopened. Families who had spent years wondering what happened to their loved ones were contacted, each phone call beginning with a pause, a heavy sigh, and the slow, painful confirmation that their worst fears had been realized. Meanwhile, Berdella sat in custody, calm and cooperative. He denied nothing, but he didn't confess either. When questioned about his meticulous notes, he spoke clinically, describing his records as personal files, insisting they had been kept for his own reference. His demeanor unsettled investigators. There was no visible remorse, no anger, no fear. It was as if he viewed the entire process, from abduction to disposal, as routine. The case captured national attention almost immediately. Media outlets flooded Kansas City, dubbing Berdella the Kansas City Butcher and the Collector. Headlines detailed the discoveries inside the house, while television broadcasts showed investigators carrying boxes of evidence into vans. The stack of Polaroids growing by the hour. The local community, once indifferent to Berdella's eccentricities, was left stunned. People who had known him for years, neighbors, flea market vendors, and customers at his shop, struggled to reconcile the friendly man they thought they knew with the horrors now revealed. Yet even as the story spread, the depth of Berdella's cruelty was still being uncovered. Analysts painstakingly worked through the notebooks, matching dates and initials with victims' identities, reconstructing a timeline of events that stretched back years. Each decoded symbol unlocked another piece of the puzzle, revealing just how deliberate every action had been. By late April 1988, prosecutors realized the case they had was unlike any they had handled before. There was no single crime scene to process, no singular act of violence to present to a jury. Instead, there was a layered archive of methodical cruelty, photographs, journals, chemicals, and tools, all of which combined to reveal a pattern of sadistic control that spanned years. Investigators were also grappling with the horrifying reality that the number of Berdella's victims might be higher than they could prove. While 6 were confirmed, the breadth of the photographs and missing persons reports suggested that others may have suffered the same fate but left no trace behind. As the investigation deepened, the quiet house on Charlotte Street transformed from a private residence into one of the most infamous crime scenes in Kansas history. Detectives, forensic teams, and federal experts worked around the clock, piecing together a narrative from thousands of fragments, each photograph, each coded note, each personal item serving as another piece of evidence in a chilling mosaic. For the families of the victims, the revelations brought devastating clarity but little comfort. Many had spent years hoping for answers, clinging to the possibility their sons and brothers were still alive somewhere. Now, they faced the reality of what had happened, the details more horrifying than anything they had imagined. The overwhelming weight of the evidence meant that Berdella's public reckoning was inevitable. His trial would not be a question of if he was guilty, but rather how much of his cruelty the court could definitively prove. The coded journals, the photographs, the chemicals, the tools, all of it would soon be laid out before a jury and the world, exposing the depths of Robert Berdella's hidden life. But even before the trial began, one thing had become painfully clear to investigators, families, and the entire city. Christopher Bryson's escape had stopped a predator who believed he could never be caught, and in the process, it had forced Kansas City and the nation to confront the existence of evil hiding in plain sight. By the time Robert Berdella was formally charged, the shockwaves from the discoveries inside 4315 Charlotte Street had already spread far beyond Kansas City. The photographs, the coded journals, and the carefully arranged collection of tools and personal belongings had painted a picture so horrifying that the upcoming trial became one of the most anticipated in Missouri's history. Prosecutors, investigators, and the public alike wanted answers, How had one man committed so many atrocities in plain sight for so many years, without being caught? The prosecution's case rested on three pillars: the hundreds of photographs recovered from Berdella's home, the detailed coded journals documenting his crimes, and the testimony of Christopher Bryson, the only victim who had escaped alive. But what made the trial especially harrowing was the sheer volume of evidence. Boxes filled with Polaroids, dozens of spiral-bound notebooks, bags containing syringes, sedatives, restraints, and improvised tools. Everything meticulously documented and catalogued, as though Berdella had built an archive of his cruelty. The photographs became the centerpiece of the prosecution's opening statements. While only a small portion were shown in court, they were enough to silence the room. Some depicted victims unconscious, bound in positions of total submission. Others showed injuries inflicted over time, evidence of prolonged torture rather than impulsive acts. Jurors were warned in advance about their graphic nature, but even so, many looked away when the first images appeared on the courtroom screens. A few members of the gallery wept quietly. Then came the journals. Prosecutors spent weeks decoding Berdella's shorthand, matching dates and initials to missing persons reports, and reconstructing a timeline of his crimes. The entries were disturbingly clinical, stripped of emotion. For each victim, there were notes about dosages, reactions to drugs, methods of restraint, and detailed observations written as if the victims were test subjects rather than human beings. Phrases like "experiment worked" and "resisted at 3:14 a.m." appeared alongside notations of when photographs had been taken, transforming the journals into an irrefutable record of calculated cruelty. Christopher Bryson's testimony was one of the most powerful moments of the trial. Calm but visibly shaken, he recounted the days he spent inside Berdella's house, from the moment he accepted a drink to the second he leapt from the second-story window in his desperate escape. He described waking up restrained, the sounds of Berdella's footsteps, and the quiet way Robert explained what would happen next, as though discussing a routine household task. Christopher told the jury how he studied Berdella's movements, waiting for an opportunity, and how he finally managed to free himself before sprinting barefoot into the street. His words made tangible the terror that hundreds of photographs and pages of notes could only suggest. Throughout Bryson's testimony, Berdella sat expressionless, occasionally taking notes or whispering with his defense attorney but never showing visible emotion. Those in the courtroom described his demeanor as detached, almost as though he were watching someone else's trial unfold rather than his own. The defense faced an insurmountable challenge. With the photographs, journals, physical evidence, and Christopher's testimony, there was little room to argue innocence. Instead, they focused on undermining specific charges, attempting to reduce potential sentences by questioning the intent behind certain acts. They argued that some deaths were accidental, the result of overdoses rather than deliberate murder, and that Berdella's obsession with documentation reflected compulsive behavior rather than sadistic intent. The prosecution countered by bringing in expert witnesses in psychology and forensic science. One psychiatrist explained the concept of coercive control, detailing how Berdella's methods stripped his victims of autonomy, breaking their will to resist. Forensic experts demonstrated the connection between the Polaroids, the journal entries, and missing persons cases, building an unbroken chain of evidence that placed Berdella at the center of each disappearance. When the coded journals were fully explained to the jury, the impact was devastating. Prosecutors showed how Berdella's notes aligned with specific victims' last known dates, connecting each initial and timestamp to the names and faces of real people, young men whose families had been left searching for years. With every entry decrypted, another layer of his meticulously maintained secrecy unraveled. transforming codes and abbreviations into chilling testaments of suffering. Perhaps the most haunting moment of the trial came when the infamous wooden box was introduced into evidence. Jurors were shown how Berdella's victims had been confined for hours or days, unable to move or see, breathing stale air while he controlled every aspect of their existence. Seeing the small, coffin-like structure shocked even seasoned investigators, and for the jurors, it transformed abstract horrors into a visceral reality. By the time closing arguments began, the narrative was clear. Robert Berdella had not acted in sudden bursts of violence or in moments of anger. His crimes were deliberate, organized, and methodical, carried out over years with chilling precision. The prosecution described him as a man who viewed human beings as experiments, subjects in a personal study of control and domination. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before reaching a verdict. On December 19, 1988, Robert Berdella was found guilty of first-degree murder, sexual assault, kidnapping, and multiple other charges tied to his confirmed victims. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never walk free again. The courtroom erupted with quiet sobs from the families of the victims. For them, the verdict brought answers, but not closure. The photographs, the journals, and the testimonies had painted vivid pictures of their loved ones' final days, but the truth was almost too much to bear. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps, broadcasting the news nationwide. The Kansas City community, still reeling from the revelations, struggled to reconcile the polite, eccentric shop owner they had known for years with the monster described inside the courtroom. For many, the shock would linger for decades, a reminder that unimaginable cruelty can hide in plain sight. In prison, Berdella initially maintained a facade of cooperation. He offered additional information about some of his crimes in exchange for small privileges, but showed no genuine remorse for his actions. He referred to his victims clinically, focusing on methods rather than names, behavior rather than humanity. In interviews, his detachment unsettled psychologists and journalists alike. The Berdella case became a pivotal moment in criminal profiling and forensic investigation. Law enforcement agencies studied his journals and photographs to better understand patterns of control and escalation in serial offenders. The case also raised broader discussions about how marginalized victims, often young men estranged from families or living transient lives, can vanish without immediate alarm, allowing predators like Berdella to operate undetected for years. For Kansas City, the legacy of 4315 Charlotte Street would endure long after Berdella was sentenced. The house became infamous, a dark landmark etched into the city's history, representing both a community's ignorance of the horrors nearby and the resilience of survivors like Christopher Bryson, whose escape finally brought the truth into the light. When the verdict was announced and Robert Berdella was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, Kansas City collectively exhaled for the first time in months. The man who had hidden in plain sight for so many years, committing acts too horrific to comprehend, was finally behind bars. Yet the ending of the trial did not bring peace. The shockwaves of his crimes would continue to ripple through the city, the families, and even the field of criminal investigation for years to come. In the weeks after the sentencing, investigators remained inside 4315 Charlotte Street, cataloging evidence, piecing together timelines, and attempting to identify every face in the hundreds of Polaroids taken by Berdella. His journals, detailed, coded, and disturbingly clinical, provided pieces of the puzzle, but many gaps remained. Dozens of initials recorded in his notebooks did not correspond to any confirmed victims, leaving open the haunting possibility that there were more young men whose stories would never be told. For the families of the confirmed victims, the trial brought answers, but not closure. Some had spent years clinging to hope, believing their missing sons, brothers, or friends might still be alive somewhere, starting over quietly. The reality they now faced, documented in Berdella's own handwriting and preserved in photographs, was almost impossible to process. Support groups formed, both formal and informal, as grieving families reached out to one another for comfort. Bound by the shared nightmare of what had happened behind closed doors on Charlotte Street, the revelations of the case forced Kansas City to confront uncomfortable truths. Many of Berdella's victims came from vulnerable backgrounds. They were young men living on the margins, battling poverty, addiction, or homelessness. Their disappearances were often overlooked, unreported, or deprioritized by the authorities. Berdella had exploited this invisibility, selecting individuals he believed would not be missed, and for years, he had been right. Community leaders and advocates began pushing for reforms. Task forces were created to improve tracking of missing persons, particularly those from at-risk populations. Police departments began training officers to treat every disappearance with urgency, regardless of background or circumstance. The case became a grim reminder that indifference and systemic failures can provide predators like Berdella the silence they need to thrive. In prison, Berdella's behavior unsettled those who interacted with him. He remained composed, often eerily calm, speaking about his crimes with the same detached tone he had used in his journals. When he agreed to interviews, journalists were struck by how emotionless his recollections were. He talked about his victims without naming them, referring instead to subjects or experiments. To him, it seemed, the people whose lives he had taken had become data points in an elaborate system he had built and believed perfected. His lack of remorse was chilling, but his self-perception was equally disturbing. Berdella saw himself not as a sadist, but as a collector and observer, someone fascinated by the boundaries of control and human endurance. He maintained until the end that his actions were deliberate but rational, an explanation that offered no comfort to the families whose loved ones never came home. Then, in 1992, just 4 years after his sentencing, Robert Berdella died unexpectedly of a heart attack at the age of 43. The news came abruptly, ending any lingering possibility of extracting the full truth from him. For many, his death was met with quiet relief. For others, it deepened the wounds, leaving unanswered questions forever buried within. The coded journals and photographs told much of the story, but without Berdella's direct admissions, the scope of his crimes could never be fully known. After his death, the infamous house at 4315 Charlotte Street became a symbol of Kansas City's darkest chapter. Crowds gathered at the small, unassuming home, staring silently at the place where so many lives had been destroyed. Some came out of grief, some out of disbelief, and others out of a morbid curiosity about the secrets it once held. Eventually, the property was sold and later demolished, as if tearing down the structure itself might erase the memories of what had taken place inside. But no demolition could erase the story. For law enforcement, the Berdella case became a turning point. His detailed journals and obsessive documentation offered rare insights into the mind of an organized offender, changing how investigators approached missing persons cases and suspected serial crimes. Criminologists have studied his methods, his escalation, and his meticulous attention to detail, using the case to train future generations of investigators. Years later, the story of Robert Berdella continues to haunt Kansas City. His name is whispered in true crime discussions, his journals examined in criminology courses, and his crimes referenced in documentaries and books. Yet beyond the sensational headlines and the disturbing photograph lies a deeper lesson about the dangers of silence, the consequences of ignoring society's most vulnerable, and the ability of evil to hide behind a mask of eccentricity and charm. For survivors like Christopher Bryson, whose escape ultimately brought Berdella down, life afterward was complicated. He carried trauma that words could barely express, yet he also bore the knowledge that his courage had saved countless others. Without his decision to jump from that second-story window and run barefoot through the streets, there is little doubt that Robert Berdella would have continued undetected for many more years. Christopher's survival stands as a testament to human resilience in the face of unspeakable horror. Today, the Berdella case endures not just because of its shocking details, but because of what it revealed about trust, secrecy, and the fragile boundaries between ordinary life and hidden evil. It forces us to ask difficult questions about how we see the people around us and how easily terrible things can unfold in places we think we know. And so, with Berdella's death and the demolition of the house on Charlotte Street, Kansas City attempted to close one of its darkest chapters. But the legacy of those events, the lessons learned, the warnings left behind, and the voices of those who were lost, continues to echo quietly, reminding us of the fragility of safety and the strength of survival. This is where the story ends. Not neatly, not comfortably, but with the understanding that while Robert Berdella's life is over, the lives he took, the families he shattered, and the scars he left behind remain an indelible part of history.